Would you risk everything for truth or for love? The city woke before the sun. In Belgrade, the dawn was more grey than gold, filtered through a veil of lingering smoke and the persistent haze of war. Even the Danube, usually a ribbon of living blue, glinted dull and cold beneath the bridges scarred by bombs and the passage of too many boots. On the battered streets, silence perched awkwardly on the windowsills, ready to scatter at the first barked command or the echo of steel heels. Elena Marković knew these streets by heart, though every day felt like learning them anew. Each corner was a test, each shadow a possible threat. She moved swiftly, the wool of her coat pulled close against the chill, her eyes alert beneath a knitted cap. The sidewalk was slick from last night's rain, and the air carried the acrid tang of burned coal and something less easily named, a fear so constant it became as much a part of the city as its stone walls. Her apartment was a cramped second-floor flat with peeling paint, the kind of place where the furniture whispered of better times. She woke before her younger brother, Stefan, to let him sleep a few moments longer. Her mother, already at work in the hospital laundry, had left a scrap of bread and a wedge of hard cheese on the kitchen table. Food was a memory rationed as strictly as hope. But Elena had learned how to stretch both. She folded a slip of paper into the lining of her worn satchel. A list of names and numbers, written in a careful hand, disguised among a page of student arithmetic. If the Gestapo searched her, God forbid, they would see only a teacher's devotion, not the lifeline she carried for the resistance. Before leaving, Elena paused by the window. Across the street, two soldiers smoked beneath a poster that screamed in red block letters, "Obey, report all suspicious activity." She watched their faces, young, bored, one with a jaw shadowed by stubble. A month ago, a neighbor had vanished after a careless word. Now everyone spoke in whispers or not at all. She wondered if her own voice would last the war. She tiptoed into Stefan's room. He lay curled on his side, a thin blanket pulled to his chin. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'll be home before curfew," she whispered, the same promise every morning, a talisman against the day's uncertainty. On the street, the city was waking under occupation. People lined up for bread, clutching ration cards stamped and re-stamped until the numbers blurred. The school was 4 blocks away, past a bakery where the scent of rye was almost enough to make her forget the ration lines, and a tram stop where soldiers lounged with rifles slung over their shoulders. She kept her gaze down, shoes scuffing the cracked pavement, rehearsing the day's lesson in her mind, as if the simple act of teaching literature could anchor this world to the one she remembered. At the school, only half the windows remained. The rest were patched with cardboard or left open to the cold. Children gathered in the yard, their faces pinched but eager, voices hushed. Elena greeted them with a smile she hoped looked real. In the classroom, the blackboard was pocked with old chalk and newer scars from shrapnel. She wrote a verse by Ivo Andrić in careful script, subtle but defiant. The children copied it quietly, glancing at the door. The air was thick with anticipation and the muffled thud of distant artillery. Between lessons, Elena slipped out to the hallway, where a janitor handed her a folded note. "From your cousin," he said, though Elena had no cousin in Belgrade. She nodded, tucking the note into her skirt pocket. She would read it later when no eyes watched. Her days were a pattern of caution and courage. She taught mathematics and poetry, translated German orders for fellow teachers, and when the corridors were empty, relayed coded messages between resistance members hidden in plain sight. Every smile was rehearsed, every word weighed. Elsewhere, the city was bracing for another kind of arrival. The train from Thessaloniki shuddered into Belgrade Central just before sunrise, clouded by the hiss of steam and the restless shifting of passengers. Among them, David Rosenfeld pressed his suitcase to his chest, his heart thumping against the forged papers tucked in his inner pocket. The station smelled of coal and sweat, and overhead, the loudspeakers crackled with warnings in clipped German. He kept his head down as he passed the checkpoint. The guard glanced at his documents, a British passport, his name anglicized to Daniel Rosen, and waved him through with a flick of the wrist. David exhaled, his lips tight. It was always this way. A moment balanced on a knife's edge, the truth of his identity tucked between the lines of official lies. He had come to Yugoslavia on assignment, But the real story was far more complicated. As a correspondent, he was tasked with capturing the plight of ordinary people under Nazi occupation. How they endured, how they resisted. But as a Jew, even with his American birth and British press credentials, every moment in this city was a risk. His family in New York believed he was in London. Only his editor and a handful of resistance contacts knew the truth. Outside the station, the city sprawled before him, roofs caved in, streetcars halted mid-track, shop windows covered in propaganda posters and blackout paper. The air buzzed with the rumor of informants. A woman swept dust from a stoop, eyes darting to the patrols that marched past in tight formation. David made his way down Kralja Milana, the main boulevard, passing a line of people waiting for rationed sugar. He stopped only once to scribble a note in his pocket notebook. City endures. People silent, wary. Hope flickers, fragile, but present. His destination was a cramped editorial office above a shuttered bookstore. The stairs creaked beneath his boots, and the hallways smelled of stale tobacco. Inside, a resistance contact, a wiry man in a frayed suit, waited by the window. "You're early," the man said in English, his accent thick. "I prefer not to wait around trains," David replied, managing a half-smile. The man handed him a battered typewriter and a slip of paper with a cipher code. "Your stories will go out by courier. No names, no locations if you're caught." "I know," David said, folding the paper into his jacket. "I don't intend to be caught." He typed his first dispatch with careful fingers, describing Belgrade as he saw it. A city bruised but not broken, its people moving like ghosts in daylight, their courage disguised as routine. He avoided mentioning his own fear, or the way his hands shook as he pressed the keys. That was not for the world to know. When the sun was high, David ventured out again, following instructions to a café near the river, a place locals called the Cellar, though the entrance was hidden behind crates of potatoes and sandbags. It was said the resistance used it to pass messages, blend among the crowd, exchange news and hope in equal measure. Inside, the café was dim, the air thick with the scent of strong coffee and damp wool. The walls were lined with faded photographs and a map of Yugoslavia, corners curling from age. A radio played faintly behind the counter, tuned to the BBC on a frequency that faded in and out. Conversation was low, careful. Strangers sat together but never too close. Elena arrived just after noon, slipping through the door with the confidence of someone who belonged. She carried a stack of student essays, a convenient excuse, and took a seat at a far table, her back to the window. She scanned the room for familiar faces, her eyes lingering on the man with the American haircut and the nervous hands. Their meeting was not planned, not by them, at least, but in wartime, coincidences were often the work of invisible hands. David ordered coffee, his accent marking him as a foreigner. Elena caught the hesitation in his voice, the way he glanced over his shoulder before speaking. She recognized the signs, a man on the edge, searching for safety. The waitress brought his coffee and a slip of paper beneath the saucer. David palmed it quickly, eyes flickering to Elena, as if measuring her trustworthiness. Elena, ever careful, leaned over with a polite smile. "Excuse me, do you have the time?" she asked in German, the language of necessity. David looked up, caught off guard by her flawless accent. "It's just past 12, he replied, matching her caution. She nodded. "Thank you. I always lose track these days." Their eyes met, hers steady, observing, his wary but open. For a moment the noise of the café faded, replaced by the pulse of something unspoken. Elena recognized the fear in his posture, the careful distance he kept from the room's corners. She wondered who he was, what he was hiding. David in turn noticed the ink stains on her fingers, the way she shielded a notebook with her forearm. A teacher, perhaps, or something more. He took a chance. "Are you new to Belgrade?" he asked, switching to English. Elena hesitated, then replied in the same language, her voice low. "No, I've always been here, but the city feels foreign now." Their exchange was brief, polite, but beneath the words, a current ran. Recognition, curiosity, the faintest hint of hope. In a world where trust was dangerous, the mere act of conversation felt forbidden. A man at the bar glanced their way, and Elena shifted her chair, placing a stack of papers between them. "You should be careful," she murmured, eyes on her cup. "I am," David said, his tone soft but resolute. Outside, the sky darkened with the threat of rain. Inside, the café hummed with secrets. Elena gathered her things, rising to leave. "Good luck," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David watched her go, the echo of her words lingering long after the door closed behind her. He finished his coffee, heart pounding, the slip of paper burning in his pocket. The message was simple: a rendezvous, a time, a name he did not recognize. But one thing was clear: trust, once sparked, was not easily extinguished, even in a city built on suspicion. As evening fell, Elena returned home through streets lined with silent windows and the distant wail of an air raid siren. She paused at her building steps, glancing back at the horizon where the city met the river, and wondered, not for the first time, what she would risk for truth or for love. In the narrowing light, two lives shaped by war and circumstance began to orbit one another. Their paths had crossed by chance or fate, or the desperate logic of survival. In Belgrade, under the watchful eyes of occupiers and the ever-present shadow of betrayal, a forbidden connection had been made. What would you risk, she thought, as she climbed the stairs to Stefan's room, for a future you could scarcely imagine? And in a darkening city, hope flickered, a fragile, forbidden thing, waiting to be kindled. Long before the bells rang to summon her students, Elena Marković was already awake. The city had not truly slept, nor had she. In the tender quiet before the city's curfew lifted, she sat at her kitchen table, the pale light creeping through the blackout curtains, careful not to give herself away. Her hands moved by memory, slicing a thin end of bread, folding it into a square of linen for her lunch, then brushing the crumbs into her palm, never wasting a crumb. She listened for the familiar clatter of boots in the corridor, but today the only sound was the distant hum of a German half-track on the cobblestones below. She reached under the table, retrieving a battered book of Serbian poetry. Its cover was a decoy. Inside, she had pressed a sliver of onion skin paper, the words scrawled in code, her task for the day. She would slip it to a contact during her walk to school, under the guise of exchanging a borrowed volume. Elena's heart pounded not from fear, but from the knowledge that each tiny act, each risk, was a thread in the tapestry of resistance that kept hope alive in Belgrade. As she made her way through the city's waking arteries, Elena's thoughts drifted back to the night at the Café Dunav. She remembered David Rosenfeld's American accent carefully disguised beneath his halting Serbian, the wary intelligence in his eyes, the brief brush of his hand as he passed her a sugar packet. A code, she realized later, for a meeting. They had exchanged only a few words, but she had sensed in him an ally, a man carrying burdens she could only begin to imagine. That morning, the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and cabbage. Ration lines already looped around the block, mothers clutching empty tins, children shuffling with hollow eyes. German patrols swept the intersections, pausing to examine papers, to bark questions in clipped voices. Elena kept her head down, the poetry book pressed to her chest. The city's wounds were everywhere. Shattered windows patched with cardboard, posters peeling from damp walls, the unspoken absence of neighbors taken in the night. She passed the shell of the synagogue on Kosmyska Street, now boarded up and silent, and whispered a silent prayer for the vanished. At the bomb-damaged school, Elena greeted her students with a practiced smile. She noticed how their uniforms had faded. Some wore shoes with cardboard soles, others had lost fathers, brothers, uncles. She gathered them around, reading from a book about distant mountains and freedom, her voice steady even as her spirit wavered. The lesson was interrupted by the shriek of air raid sirens. The children ducked under their desks, hands clamped over their ears, as the walls trembled with each distant impact. Elena counted their breaths, whispering reassurances until the silence returned. Later, during the lunch break, Elena slipped into the alley behind the school, where a young man in a postman's cap waited. She handed him the poetry book, his eyes flickering to the coded page inside. Their exchange was swift, practiced, barely a nod before he melted into the crowd. Elena pressed her back to the wall, breathing in the damp, metallic air, and wondered how many more days she could endure living on the edge of discovery. Across the city, in a cramped office above a bakery, David hunched over his battered typewriter. The keys stuck on certain letters, the ribbon was faded, but he coaxed words from it all the same. He described the ration lines, the faces of mothers worn thin by hunger and worry, the silent defiance of children clutching books instead of rifles. His editor back in London demanded facts and figures, but David gave them stories, snapshots of ordinary courage, glimpses of suffering and hope. He wrote in English, then in code, careful to hide anything that would betray his true self. The Gestapo's net was tightening. 2 correspondents had been arrested last week, their names whispered in fear. David's forged papers marked him as a Canadian, but his accent, his manner, his very presence in the city made him a target. He kept his Star of David hidden in the lining of his coat, a talisman, a burden, a secret he could not share with anyone, almost anyone. That evening, as dusk crept in and the city slipped into its nightly shroud, David made his way to the Café Dunav. The underground café pulsed with nervous energy, the clink of glasses and low laughter barely masking the tension. Elena was there, her hair pinned back in a simple twist, her eyes scanning the room with practiced care. She caught his gaze and nodded, a signal. They sat in a shadowed booth, their conversation outwardly mundane. Weather, lessons, the price of beans. Underneath, their words danced around danger. David slid a folded scrap of paper across the table, pretending to wipe a spill. Elena tucked it into her sleeve, her hands steady but her breath shallow. "Today, an officer questioned one of my students," she murmured, her voice low. "He wanted to know who had painted slogans on the school wall. The boys are so young, David. They don't understand the risk." David reached for her hand, just for a moment. "We're all afraid. But what you're doing matters. If there's anything I can do," she shook her head. "You're already doing it. Your words. People need to know." A moment passed, heavy with unspoken fears. David hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's something I haven't told you." His voice barely more than a whisper. "My real name isn't Daniel Ross. It's David Rosenfeld. I'm American, and I'm Jewish." Eleanor's eyes widened, but she did not flinch. "You trust me with this?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "If they find out it's not just me, anyone who helps me—" She squeezed his hand. "You're not alone, David. Not here." Their connection, fragile and forbidden, deepened in that silent exchange. But as they parted, Eleanor felt the weight of new dangers settle on her shoulders. She watched David disappear into the night, his silhouette swallowed by the curfew's darkness. The next morning a new poster appeared on the school wall, names of suspected resistance sympathizers, a warning scrawled in red. Elena's heart stuttered as she scanned the list. Her name was not there, not yet. But she saw the postman's name and 2 others she recognized from the cafe. She tore down the paper, her hands trembling, knowing it would be replaced by morning. At home her mother waited, eyes hollow with worry. "You must be careful, Lena," she whispered, pressing a ration card into her hand. "There are rumors. The Gestapo is watching the teachers." Elena hugged her tightly. "I know, Mama. I'm careful." But safety was an illusion. That evening, as she prepared a thin soup of potatoes and cabbage, a sharp knock rattled the door. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She hid the coded messages in the lining of her coat and smoothed her skirt before answering. A neighbor, Mrs. Petrovich, stood in the hallway, her face pinched with fear. "They took Marco, the Germans. He was only delivering bread." Eleanor drew her inside, offering comfort and a crust of bread. The Gestapo's shadow lengthened with every visit, every disappearance. Meanwhile, David's reports grew bolder. He filed stories about the missing, the hunger, the quiet heroism of the city's women and children. His words made their way to London, then to New York, stirring sympathy and outrage. But with each dispatch, he felt the net drawing tighter. One night, as he typed by candlelight, a sharp rap sounded at the door. David froze, his fingers poised above the keys. He had memorized his escape route, a back window, a narrow alley that led to the river. He waited, breath held, as the knocking faded. Only then did he exhale, sweat beading on his brow. The next morning in the cafe, Elena found him pale and shaken. "They came to my building," he whispered. "I think someone's watching me." She reached into her satchel, pulling out a letter. "It's from the resistance. They want you to help document an execution site. Tonight, if you're caught." David met her gaze, fear and resolve warring in his eyes. "I'll do it. But Elena, when if anything happens, don't," she cut in fiercely. "We're not finished. Not yet." Together, under the cover of darkness, they crossed the city, ducking into alleys, crawling through holes in barbed wire, hearts pounding in unison. The site was a field on the city's edge, marked by a row of shallow graves. Elena kept watch as David photographed the evidence, his hands trembling. The horror was overwhelming, but they worked quickly, knowing the risk. As they slipped away, footsteps echoed behind them. A patrol. They pressed themselves into the shadows, barely daring to breathe. The patrol passed, their flashlights slicing through the night. Elena clung to David's arm, her body pressed against his, and in that moment, the world narrowed to the sound of their twin heartbeats. When the danger had passed, they released each other, the unspoken promise of more, if fate allowed. Days blurred into weeks. The city's suffering deepened, but so did their bond. They found solace in small things, a stolen moment in the park, a smile exchanged over rationed tea, a letter left in a hollow tree. Elena wrote, "In another world, we would have met in daylight, without fear." David replied, "I would have found you, in any world." But the war pressed closer. An informant, a gaunt man with sharp eyes, began lingering near Elena's building. She saw him watching her, felt his gaze in the back of her neck. At school, a German officer questioned the staff, his tone mild but his eyes cold. "We are looking for traitors," he announced. "Anyone with information should come forward." Elena's hands shook as she marked her students' papers that night. Her mother watched her silent, knowing but never asking. The strain grew unbearable. She wanted to run, to hide, to take David, and disappear. But duty tethered her, her students, her family, the resistance, and David too was torn. His reports were now read in London and Washington, but he dreaded the day his notoriety would bring danger to Elena. One afternoon, as clouds gathered for another storm, Elena slipped into the café. David was waiting, his face grave. "They know about me, Lena. The Gestapo. My editor says I should leave, but I can't. Not without you." Tears pricked her eyes. "I can't leave. My mother, the children. If I disappear, they'll punish them." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I can't ask you to make that choice." They sat in silence, the world outside growing darker, the cafe's lights flickering as the power faltered. Around them, people laughed and gossiped, but an undercurrent of fear rippled through the room. That night, as Elena walked home, rain slicked the streets, turning them to rivers of ash and mud. She passed the informant, his gaze sharp, his mouth twisted in a sneer. She hurried past, heart pounding, knowing the walls were closing in. Inside her apartment, she found a note slipped under the door. 3 words scrawled in haste. "They are coming." She pressed a hand to her lips, fighting panic. She had to warn David. She grabbed her coat, the coded messages still hidden in the lining, and slipped into the night. Across the city, David waited at the riverbank, the signal agreed upon in their last desperate conversation. When Elena appeared, breathless and soaked, he pulled her into his arms. "We can't stay," she whispered. "They know about you, about me." He nodded, his face set. "I'm not leaving you behind." Elena shook her head, tears mingling with the rain. "I can't abandon them. My mother, the children. I'll stay. But you must go." David's jaw clenched. "If I go, I'll never forgive myself." She pressed his hand, her voice fierce. "You must live. Tell them our story. Promise me, David." He drew her close, their lips meeting in a brief, desperate kiss. "I promise." The city's bells rang midnight, tolling for the lost, the living, and those who loved in defiance of war. As they parted, each step away was a rending, a tearing of the fragile thread that bound them. Elena slipped into the darkness, her secret heavy in her heart. David watched her go, the weight of his promise anchoring him to the mud-soaked riverbank. In Belgrade, love was as forbidden as hope, but neither could be extinguished. When the world is falling apart, Will love be enough to hold you together? If you're as moved by Elena and David's story as I am, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for the next gripping chapter. Share your thoughts below. Would you have the courage to risk everything, even your heart, in a time of war? Rain hammered the red-tiled roofs of Belgrade, turning narrow alleys into glistening veins of uncertainty. The city, battered and bruised, seemed to hold its breath. Even the Gestapo patrols moved with a new predatory caution, eyes flickering to every doorway and hunched figure. On days like this, Elena Marković felt the weight of every secret she carried, hidden in the creases of her coat, the trembling of her hands, and the pulse that quickened whenever footsteps echoed behind her. She crossed the threshold of her apartment, careful as always to close the door without a sound. The rooms were dark, blackout curtains pressed tight against the windows, their edges stitched with nervous fingers late into many nights. Her mother, pale and frail, sat in the corner, darning socks by the meager light of a candle stub. "Elena," she whispered, voice thin as paper. "Be careful today." Elena forced a smile, squeezing her mother's hand. "I always am." But today, Elena knew, was already different. The coded message she'd received at the underground café last night still burned in her memory. Operation Midnight Sun, tonight, the bridge, bring the American. The risk, she understood, was beyond anything she'd faced before. David Rosenfeld had arrived just after dusk, his face drawn, the brim of his hat pulled low. He carried damp newspapers under his arm, their pages hiding a smaller, folded slip of paper, her instructions, smuggled through 3 sets of hands. They sat in the shadowed corner of her kitchen, the air thick with tension and the scent of boiled potatoes. "You're sure of this?" he asked, voice low but steady. Rainwater beaded on his coat, darkening the wool. Elena nodded, jaw set. "The resistance needs your witness. They want the world to see what's happening here. If the explosives work, if the bridge goes down, maybe it will slow them. Maybe it will matter." David's hands shook as he unwrapped the message again. He'd come to this country to report the truth, but now he was tangled in it, every heartbeat a negotiation with fear. The bridge, Stary Savski Most, was a vital artery for German supply lines. Destroying it would mean retaliation, swift and brutal, but it might also be the only chance the resistance had. "There's more," Elena said, voice barely above a whisper. "We've been followed. The informant, the one with the scar, he asked about you at the ration line. He knows you're not who you say." David's mouth tightened. He thought of the forged papers tucked inside his boot, the Star of David he no longer dared wear. He looked at Elena, saw the fire in her eyes, and felt the claws of hope and dread both tightening. "We do this," he said finally, "and we do it together. After tonight there's no turning back." Night came early, pressed low and heavy on the city. Elena and David left separately, as always, careful to avoid the gaze of neighbors. She moved through the alleys, steps quick but measured, her satchel clutched tight. The air was thick with the promise of storm. Thunder rolled, distant but coming closer. The rendezvous point was a cellar beneath a half-ruined bakery. Inside, the resistance members waited, a tangle of faces Elena knew only by code names: Falcon, Sparrow, Black Dog. An oil lamp sputtered in the corner, casting every face in restless shadow. Falcon, the leader, nodded grimly as Elena entered. "You brought him?" She hesitated, then opened the door to the stairwell. David descended, boots scraping the stone, eyes scanning every angle. Falcon's gaze was appraising. "Do you trust him?" "With my life," Elena answered. Falcon grunted. "Let's hope that's enough." The plan was simple and impossible. 2 teams, one to plant explosives beneath the bridge, the other to create a diversion on the far side. David's role was riskier still. He would photograph the operation, then smuggle his film out with Sparrow, who had contacts in the British consulate. If the world saw that Yugoslavs still fought, maybe the Allies would send help. Maybe. David's hands barely trembled as he loaded his camera. Elena watched him, her heart a riot of fear and pride. In the corner, Black Dog muttered to Sparrow, "He's too obvious, that one. An American here. It's suicide." Elena caught David's eye, a silent plea. "Stay invisible. Trust me." The city clock struck midnight as they reached the underbelly of the Stary Savski Most, The Danube roared below, black as spilled ink. Elena crouched beside Falcon, fingers numb as she passed wires and fuses. David hung back, snapping quick, silent photos, the curve of a resistance fighter's jaw, the trembling hands attaching charges, the faces lit only by lightning. Suddenly a sharp whistle cut through the night, the signal for trouble. From the northern embankment, the diversion team's gunfire exploded. Shouts, German voices, ripped through the darkness. Searchlights swung wildly, their beams slicing the rain. "Move!" Falcon hissed. Elena grabbed David's arm, dragging him behind a crumbling pillar. Gunfire spat at the shadows, bullets shattering stone. Falcon and Black Dog worked furiously, setting the last charge. David ducked, heart hammering, camera clenched to his chest. He saw Elena's face, pale, determined, beautiful even now. He wanted to speak, to tell her everything he felt, but there was no time. A grenade exploded on the bridge above. The shockwave shuddered through the beams. Screams. The night spun into chaos. "Go!" Falcon shouted. "Run! The fuse is set!" Elena and David bolted, sprinting through the mud and rain, chased by barking orders and the staccato of machine guns. The bridge behind them lit up in a blossoming burst of orange, explosives detonating, steel shrieking as the central span buckled. But something was wrong. The charges had only partially detonated. The bridge was badly damaged, but still standing. Worse, the Germans were regrouping fast. Elena ducked into an alley, dragging David with her. Their breaths came in ragged gasps. Sirens wailed across the city. "We have to get to Sparrow," Elena whispered. "He has the film. If they catch him—" David nodded, face streaked with rain and fear. They ran again, weaving through the labyrinth of ruined streets toward the safe house. Outside the bakery, Sparrow waited. His face was white, hands shaking. "They know," he gasped. "Someone talked. They know you're here." Before Elena could reply, headlights seared the darkness. A truck screeched to a halt. German soldiers spilled out, barking orders, guns raised. David pressed the film into Sparrow's hand. "Go! Get it out!" "Tau!" Sparrow hesitated, fear warring with resolve. Then he vanished into the night. Elena and David pressed themselves against the wall, searching for any way out. The soldiers fanned out, boots pounding on wet cobblestones. One, the informant with the scar, a man Elena recognized from the ration line, locked eyes with her. "There!" he shouted. Gunfire erupted. Elena and David fled, dashing through an open doorway and crashing up a narrow staircase. The building shook with the weight of pursuit. On the landing, Elena turned. "Go, David, I'll hold them." He grabbed her shoulders, desperate. "No, I won't leave you." Tears mingled with rain on Elena's cheeks. "If they catch you, they'll kill you. I have family, I can't—" David shook his head, voice breaking. "I love you. I'm not leaving you behind." A door splintered below. Boots hammered on stairs. Elena pressed her lips to David's, fierce and fleeting. "Then we run, together." They burst onto the roof, the city unfurling beneath them in shards of moonlight and fire. The bridge still smoldered in the distance. Sirens blared, flames licking at the edges of the night. Below, the soldiers shouted, closer and closer. David spotted a gap between rooftops, a mad leap but the only chance. He took Elena's hand. "Trust me." She nodded, eyes wide with terror and hope. They ran, feet slipping on wet tiles, and leapt. For a moment, they hung in the air, weightless, defiant. Then they crashed onto the next rooftop, rolling hard. Elena groaned, clutching her side. David pulled her up, adrenaline burning away the pain. Behind them, the soldiers reached the roof. Shots rang out, shattering tiles inches from David's head. They scrambled down a drainpipe, dropping into the alley as bullets chewed the brick above. Elena staggered, but David caught her. They ducked into a narrow archway, hearts pounding. For a moment, only rain and their frantic breathing filled the world. Then a voice, a low, urgent whisper from the shadows. "This way." It was Black Dog, bloodied but alive. He led them through a maze of back streets, finally slipping into the sanctuary of an abandoned church. Candles flickered before shattered icons. The air smelled of wax and damp stone. "We lost Falcon," Black Dog rasped. "Sparrow got away, But the Germans, they know who you are now, both of you. There's no going back. Elena collapsed onto a pew, shaking. David knelt beside her, clutching her hands. "What do we do?" Elena whispered. "We can't stay here. My family, my mother." Black Dog shook his head. "The city's locked down. They'll search every house. If you're caught, they'll make examples of you both." David's mind raced. "We have to get out. The British lines. They're only 50 kilometers west. If we can reach them." Elena stared at him, tears brimming. 50 kilometers. "Through patrols, checkpoints." David wiped her cheek, gentle. "We'll go together. We'll make it, I promise." Black Dog handed David a battered map, lines traced in trembling pencil. "Take the river. At dawn, the patrols change. You might have a chance." Suddenly, the church door rattled, a fist pounding, voices shouting in German. Black Dog's eyes widened. "Go, out the vestry window. Now!" Elena and David scrambled, crawling through the narrow opening, tumbling into the overgrown graveyard beyond. They ran, ducking behind gravestones, the shouts receding as the rain masked their trail. At the riverbank, the Danube waited, wide, cold, and merciless. A battered rowboat bobbed in the reeds. Elena hesitated, fear rooting her in place. David squeezed her hand. "We have to try." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "If we're separated—" "We won't be," he vowed, voice fierce. "Not again." They climbed into the boat, hands raw on the oars. The city shrank behind them, sirens wailing, flames flickering, the bridge a broken skeleton against the dawn. Halfway across, the current caught them, dragging them north. Elena clung to David as the boat spun, water lapping over the sides. In the grey light of morning, they reached the far bank, soaked, shivering, alive. For a moment, they simply held each other, the world reduced to breath and heartbeat. But then, footsteps, voices, British soldiers, rifles raised, eyes wary. David stood, arms raised. "We're friends. Americans, journalist. She's with me." One soldier stepped forward, frowning. "Papers." David reached for his pocket, then stopped, remembering. The forged documents were gone, lost in the river. Elena spoke, voice calm but desperate. "He's telling the truth. He risked everything to help us. Please, help us." The officer studied them for a long moment, then lowered his rifle. "Come with us. Quickly." They staggered up the bank, exhaustion threatening to swamp them. The British camp was a blur of tents and mud, but it was safety. A miracle. In a canvas tent, warm at last, David collapsed beside Elena. For the first time in weeks, he let himself believe they might survive. But as he closed his eyes, a British officer entered, grave and unsmiling. "We have your photographs," the officer said quietly. "The world will know what happened here. But your story isn't over. The Germans know your names. You can't go back." Elena reached for David's hand, her voice steady. "We still have each other." David squeezed her fingers, tears in his eyes. "We made it. Together. But the cost of love, of truth, pressed close, a reminder of all they'd lost and everything they'd risked. The city they'd left behind would never be the same, and neither would they. Yet in that tent, as dawn painted the sky with the first fragile rays of hope, Elena and David held each other anew. They had changed the world, if only by refusing to let it destroy their hearts. The first hints of spring crept into Belgrade as the war ground on, timid shafts of sunlight on battered stone, the faintest scent of thaw in the air. But for Elena and David, the city felt frozen in the aftermath of the failed resistance operation that had nearly torn their fragile world apart. A week had passed since that night of chaos and shattered plans. The memory of gunfire and shouts, of running through labyrinthine alleys, hearts hammering, the taste of fear sharp on the tongue, still haunted Elena's sleep. In the days that followed, the city seemed to shrink even further. Every street more perilous, every glance thick with suspicion. The Gestapo had swept through neighborhoods with brutal efficiency, and those who remained were left to repair what was left of their lives behind blackout curtains and locked doors. David had not left the safety of the tiny editorial office, except under the cover of darkness. His American accent and haunted eyes hidden behind borrowed coats and a battered Yugoslav cap. He wrote by candlelight, chronicling the aftermath with a trembling hand, never mentioning names, least of all Elena's, but pouring all his grief and hope into each line. His reports were smuggled out with the help of resistance couriers, but he knew it was only a matter of time before his presence was no longer tolerated by either side. For Elena, each day was a study in restraint. She went to the school as always, tending to her students with a quiet, almost desperate tenderness. She listened for rumors about the failed operation, about the informant who had disappeared, about the American journalist who was suddenly the subject of whispered conversations. Her mother, whose hands shook as she kneaded rationed flour into bread, watched Elena with fearful eyes as if she could sense the weight of the secrets her daughter carried. Yet within Elena, something had shifted. The failure of the operation, the loss of friends, the nearness of death. It had burned away her illusions. She saw now that there was no perfect balance between duty and love. There was only the choice to act, with full knowledge of the risks and a heart unguarded. Risk, she realized, was the only certainty the war allowed. One night, as the city curled into itself beneath curfew, Elena slipped from her apartment and made her way through the maze of silent streets. She moved with purpose, every sense sharpened by danger and longing. At the edge of the old quarter she found David waiting in the shadows, his breath misting in the cold air, his face gaunt but determined. They met without words, hands clasping tight, the silence between them full of everything left unspoken. "I have to leave," David said at last, voice barely a whisper. "They're closing in, Elena. The resistance can get me out, if I go tonight." Elena felt the words settle in her chest like stones. "And if you don't?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "If I stay, I endanger you, all of you." He searched her face, desperate for understanding. "But I can't leave you behind." She pressed a trembling hand to his cheek, savoring the roughness of his unshaven jaw, the warmth of his skin. "You have to go, David. You have to live. You have to tell the world what happened here. Promise me." He shook his head, tears shining in his eyes. "I will, I promise, but Elena, come with me. We can disappear together. We can start over." For a moment, the world shrank to the space between them. Elena saw in his eyes the hope she had nearly forgotten, the dream of a life beyond war, of mornings spent in sunlight instead of shadow, of laughter and peace. But she also saw the faces of her students, the courage of her friends, the city that had shaped her and suffered with her. "I can't leave," she said softly, her voice steady even as her heart broke. "This is my home, my family, my fight. But you must survive, David. Survive for both of us." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, clinging to her as if he could hold back the tide of history itself. She felt his tears on her skin mingling with her own and knew that this was the price of loving in a world on fire. They parted before dawn at the edge of the Danube. The river flowed black and silent, bearing witness to the sorrows of the city. David pressed a folded page into Elena's hand, a letter, written in hurried script, words of devotion and hope she would read again and again in the years to come. He boarded a resistance truck at the city's edge, hidden beneath tarps and crates, his eyes never leaving Elena's until the last possible moment. She stood on the bank, arms wrapped around herself, watching until the truck vanished into the mist. The days that followed were both emptier and brighter. Elena threw herself into her work, teaching children whose worlds had been shattered, weaving lessons of resilience and compassion into every hour. She became a quiet leader in the resistance, her courage and clarity earning the trust of those who had once doubted her resolve. She mourned her losses, but did not let them harden her heart. Instead, she allowed them to deepen her empathy, to refine her purpose. Rumors drifted in from the countryside of an American journalist who had reached Allied lines, whose reports were being published in London and New York, whose words stirred compassion and outrage in equal measure. Elena knew, even before she saw the battered clippings smuggled into the city, that David had kept his promise. His stories bore witness not just to suffering, but to bravery and love in the face of darkness. One afternoon, as the city endured another air raid, Elena gathered her students in the basement of the school. The children huddled together, frightened but trusting. Elena began to read to them, her voice calm and steady, weaving tales of courage and kindness. In that moment, she realized that survival was not enough. To endure was to hope, to love, to build something lasting from the ashes. Months passed. The war dragged on. The city changed, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. Elena never forgot David, nor did she close her heart to the possibility of seeing him again. She wrote letters she could never send, filled journals with memories and dreams. She lived each day as if it might be the last, but also as if it might be the first of something new. And then, one rain-washed evening long after the fighting had faded, Elena returned home to find a letter waiting on her doorstep. The handwriting was careful, unfamiliar, but the signature was his, David. The letter spoke of distant lands and difficult journeys, of longing and gratitude, of a love that had survived not because it was easy, but because it was true. Elena held the letter to her heart, tears spilling down her cheeks. She knew then that the war had changed her, had taken things she could never recover, but it had also given her a strength she had never imagined. She had learned to risk everything for love, and in doing so, had found herself. As the city slowly healed, Elena continued to teach, to hope, and to remember. She wore David's letter close to her heart, a talisman against despair. She believed that one day, when the world was ready, she would see him again, not as fugitives, but as survivors who had dared to love in the darkest of times. And so, the story of Elena and David endures, a testament to the power of love and courage, even when the world is broken. If this story touched you, if you felt the heartbreak and the hope of Elena and David, let us know in the comments. What would you risk for love or for truth? If you found yourself swept up in their world, please like this video, subscribe for more unforgettable stories, and click the bell so you never miss a moment of courage and connection. Your support helps keep these stories alive, reminding us that even in our darkest hours, love and hope can light the way. Thank you for listening, for remembering and for believing in the power of human connection. Until next time, hold your loved ones close and never stop hoping for peace.